Okay, so we're going to go over several different types of cuts and also how the tree will react to them. So first we have the top cut. So we have our limb. The top cut is when you come straight on top and cut the limb. Now, what will happen is either the limb will hang here, or most of the time it'll peel the bark this way, closer towards the trunk of the tree, and then fall off foliage first. And when it falls off foliage first, it's unpredictable where it will bounce. This is not an ideal cut. There are very few situations where this is acceptable, but it's good to know what will happen if you do cut as a top cut. Next we have our snap cut. Snap cut is when you have either a stem or a limb going out horizontally, of course. And you cut in one side about halfway through, and you come on the other side just a couple inches above and overlap the cut. This is really useful for any kind of stems or any vertical pieces that are going straight up and down, because you can cut it, the limb or the stem will remain stable, and then you can take your hands and push it back and forth, and it'll break off, and then you can throw it down in the drop zone with your hands, which is a really controlled type of way to deal with any kind of upright stems. If it has any kind of foliage on the top, it's going to be much harder to deal with just because of the weight and the imbalances of it all. So be careful if there's any foliage. It works really well when it's just pieces of wood. Now, if a limb is, of course, the limb is going out horizontally, what you want to do is not cut on the top and then the bottom, because there's a lot greater chance, because of gravity, that it'll break off and fall down. What you want to do is, if we're looking at the middle of the branch, looking inwards, what you want to do is cut on the sides. There's much less of a chance that it'll break off. So anytime you're dealing with a horizontal limb, we'll just cut from the sides instead of the top and bottom. That way you can deal with it much easier, because it's a less chance that it'll break off. Next we have an under-over cut. And we have our limb. And what this cut is going to allow the limb to do is fall completely flat on the ground. But it's pretty hard to execute, especially if we have a lot of weight in this area over here. So what we need to do is come from the bottom and then come directly over top. And what's going to happen is this area right here, the butt end of the limb, is going to pop off and allow the limb to fall completely flat. But there's a couple things we need to know. First, it's pretty easy to get your saw stuck on the bottom, because you really have to get as deep of a cut as you can without getting your saw cut for this, or your saw stuck for this cut to actually work. And a lot of times, if it has any kind of weight on this area, you also have to cut in on the sides, a little bit on the side of there. So if we're looking at the limb straight on, we would come bottom cut here, cut a little bit of the area here. Then you would want to actually eliminate some of this wood tissue on the sides here as well. Then come down on the top. And at this point, you'll really get the pop off of the butt end of the limb, and it'll fall completely flat. Next, we have notching. Notching is when you want to guide a stem or a limb in a certain direction. Now, anytime we have a stem, and we need to drop it, if we have taglines or anything like that, or just straight up, we're just dropping it, you always need to use a notch. That's going to guide it into the direction that the notch is facing. Now, the rule is about 30% cut into the wood tissue for your notch. And on the back side, you cut in about 60% of the wood tissue, leaving 10% of holding wood, which will allow this stem to fall right into the notch. And once these two areas right here, once these two hinges, walls meet, that's when the stem or the limb is going to break off. Now, we can either have, so it's really going to depend on the situation, how wide or closed, open or closed you want your notch. You can do an open face notch and it'll take longer for the stem to break off because it has no breaking point. Once these two places meet, that's when it's going to break off. It'll allow you to manipulate how you want the wood to land, basically. Now, when you're notching any kind of limbs, we're basically trying to get them in a desired direction. So maybe you're trying to make sure it doesn't hit a certain piece of property or land in a certain way. So if we have a branch that's just going straight out and we want to notch it this way, then we put our notch a little bit facing downward, just a little bit slightly, so it can hinge over into the notch. And then we would make our back cut, and it would allow the limb to basically swing over this direction. Now, if the limb is at all facing this direction, you would have to put a tagline on it and have someone pull it over just to get it started past this equilibrium point. And once it starts going and swinging, then the hinge will take over. It's also important to know that once it starts hinging over, you definitely want to finish your cut and get to that 10% of wood or possibly less, depending on the size or the species of tree. But at least get to that 10% of your holding wood when you're making these notches, or else it's going to hold on to that hinge. And then all of a sudden, you might have a situation where it's similar to just a top cut because it has a lot of holding wood left, and then it's just going to fall over foliage first, and then you have a problem because it's unpredictable where it will land. Last cut I want to talk about is the spear cut, and this is basically only used on stems or limbs that are facing up and down vertically. And what you want to do is, at an angle, come in at the top, at a steep angle, cut down into the tissue. Now, if we're looking at this straight on, we also would want to come down on the top. Then we'd want to, so this is eliminated, this wood tissue. Then we would want to eliminate some of this tissue on the side, because this allows less holding wood over here. And when we make our finishing cut, which for the spear cut needs to be pretty quick, or else it'll just lean over and fall flat, because the whole idea behind the spear cut is that it slides off of this cut and comes straight down. But if it has holding wood, then it'll just teeter over, and then it's going to be facing horizontally. So the whole goal is to make it so it cuts, and then the cut piece falls butt end first to the ground. terrible arrow. Anyways, so if we're looking at straight on, we go a little bit in the top, cut off, eliminate that wood tissue on the side, and then we can all of a sudden come down and start cutting back on top again, and it'll make our final cut smoother and quicker and allow the piece of wood to fall straight down butt end. This is really good whenever you have maybe a thick canopy and a bunch of limbs you're eliminating that are going straight up, and it'll give them a better chance to fall through the canopy if they're going butt in first. It's also really good if you're ever removing a tree and you would have a rig point at the top, but that doesn't happen too often. But just remember, the spear cut is really good for when you're trying to make the limb fall butt in first. Anyways, those are the 5 different types of cuts, and we'll see you next time.